Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to also thank Gabi and Marcia and the colleagues here at the EUI for the organization of the event. I'm going to be presenting about South America. Some of you know, well, I'm a lawyer, first of all, and second of all, I'm writing a book about the legal construction of the foreigner in South America since independence until today. But what I'm going to be presenting today departs a little bit from that legal work and try to enter into an analysis of the interviews that I have been conducting in South America. I have conducted almost 70 interviews in 6 countries in South America. The ones in Chile were conducted actually by Marcia, but I was in Chile also recently, so I had the opportunity to speak with many of the people we had interviewed before. And as you know, and as Andrew has explained already, the MIGPROSP project tries to understand better how actors who influence migration laws and policies, how they understand migration, and how that understanding of migration affects the outcomes that we have afterwards in laws and in policies. One thing that is clear in South America is that at least at a discursive level, we have a different understanding of migration. I always like to begin with this sentence. For those of you who don't know much about the region, I think it's a sentence that really captures how South America has been framing migration issues in the last, since the turn of the century, basically. So as you can see, it's a very open discourse. It's a sentence that you wouldn't find presented, for example, by the European Commission, right? There is the discussion about the human right to migration. There are discussions there about non-criminalization of irregular migration. There are discussions about respect of the rights of migrants, etc. And I think this summarizes and this shows clearly that actors dealing with migration in the region have a different understanding on migration governance than other regions. And at least so far, well, we know there have been changes in governments in different countries in South America in the last couple of years, in Brazil, in Argentina, etc. But at least discursively, this has remained. So this discourse, a very open discourse on migration, has remained. And so what I'd like to do now is to see how, well, this tells me that possibly the actors shaping and influencing migration law in South America, including politicians, officials, government officials, regional organizations, NGOs, and civil society, possibly they have in many respects different understandings of the governance of migration from what we find in other regions in the world. And this commonality of views, as Andrew explained earlier, has been reinforced by a proliferation of regional organizations. So this is also very clear in South America. We have not less regional organizations, rather we have more and more fora where different officials at different levels meet to discuss migration. So we have now UNASUR, MERCOSUR, Andean Community, South American Conference on Migration, Pacific Alliance, CELAC, etc. So we have more and more fora, more and more organizations, as Andrew mentioned before. From this discourse, there are 3 main principles that are emerging. And what I do in my legal analysis in the book is to try to understand what these 3 principles mean legally speaking. What I'm trying to do here today is a little bit different, as I said. These 3 principles are the first one, non-criminalization of irregular migration, which in principle you will think applies to irregular migrants, right? So apply to the category of those who are in an irregular situation. The second idea, or the second principle emerging, is this idea of the right to migrate as a fundamental right, which in principle you will say applies to those who are regular migrants, to those who have a residence permit, right? And the third idea is opening borders at regional level, some discussions also about South American citizenship, and this will apply in turn to those who are regional migrants, right? That will be the idea. What I want to do today, and what I want to start thinking about with you, and what I would like to do in a future paper, is to see how, first of all, the relevant actors in the region understand these principles. That will be my first interest. So for example, what do we mean by non-criminalization? Do we mean by non-criminalization that detention of irregular migrants is prohibited, and that's it? Or do we mean something different? How do the actors influencing migration understand this principle of non-criminalization of irregular migration? The same for the other 2 principles, right? So for example, what do we mean by open borders at regional level? Do we mean that there are no visas between the different countries so that people can move for tourist purposes without a visa? Or do we mean that people have the right to reside and work in a different country in the region? What do we mean by that, right? The second thing that I want to explore further is how actors understand these three different legal categories: irregular migrants, regional migrants, and irregular migrants, regular migrants, and regional citizens. And the third thing that I would like to explore is how actors understand the interplay between these three different categories. Let me give you a couple of examples so you understand better what I mean by the interplay between the different categories, and then I'll show you some quotes before I finish with something different that comes from a reflection I had this morning about the new Brazilian migration law. The MERCOSUR Residence Agreement, to explain it very, very quickly for those of you who don't know about it, is an agreement that is in place, is in force since 2009 in the region, and basically means that migrants or citizens from 9 countries out of 12 in South America now have the right to reside in a different country in the region. All countries in South America except for Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana. Basically, first you obtain a temporary residence permit for 2 years, then you can transform that temporary residence permit into a permanent one after those 2 years, and you have a number of rights: family reunification, right to work under equal conditions, certain civil rights, socioeconomic rights, etc. But the interesting thing is that there are many interplays between different categories. Of course, this agreement is addressed to those who are regional migrants, right? But what you see is that there are many different interplays between irregular migrants, regular migrants, and regional migrants. So let me give you a couple of examples so you understand that better. The first contradiction is that in order to be able to use the MERCOSUR Residence Agreement, one avenue will be to be already irregular in another country. So let's imagine a Brazilian who is irregular in Argentina. Then that Brazilian could apply for a residence permit under the agreement and therefore become regular for 2 years. But after those 2 years, he needs to prove that he has sufficient resources. And otherwise, the agreement itself tells you that you become irregular again. So if you see, it's a circular kind of ideology there. Another example will be those who remain irregular, even if they are regional citizens, because in order to benefit from the agreement, you need to have, first of all, proof of having a clean criminal record. Otherwise, you cannot benefit from the agreement. So, for example, I was recently in Ecuador, and there were many discussions about Venezuelans to whom Ecuador applies the agreement, even though Venezuela is not part of the agreement. Venezuelans not being able to get a clean criminal record from their consulate because of the particular situation in Venezuela. Right now, the consulate in Ecuador is not functioning very well. So there are many Venezuelans in Ecuador who cannot get a proof of a clean criminal record, and therefore they cannot benefit from the agreement. So even though they are regional migrants, they remain irregular migrants, right? And then an idea also about family migration, because the only way in which you are always certain that you are going to be regular in a country, being a regional migrant, is if you have children who are born in that country. So remember, in South America, we have jus soli. So if your children are born in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Chile, it doesn't matter. They become Chileans, Argentinians, Ecuadorians, etc. And all the laws have a clear provision saying if your children are nationals, you cannot be expelled. And that comes from the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. So as you can see, there are many contradictions in the way we can frame who is irregular, who is regular, who is a regional migrant, right? So what I want to do is to see whether this is a problem for actors influencing basically the policies and the laws in this area. So what I'm gathering from the interviews is that possibly a first problem that we have here is that these three principles, non-criminalization, open borders, and right to migrate, were not really principles that were put forward in order to think about immigrants. They were principles that were put forward in order to think about emigrants. So Ecuadorians abroad, Brazilians abroad, Colombians abroad, etc. And this is something that comes very clear from my interviews. It comes from our interviews. It comes very clearly in the sense that of when migration entered the agenda. So migration entered the agenda when these countries realized that they had a large number of emigrants abroad. And also when, so this is the first quote, basically. And then the second quote that I have here is how countries regulate their migration laws. So they're always thinking about more first of all, about emigrants rather than immigrants. So that might lead to the contradictions that then are found in the law when it comes to immigration. The second aspect that I'm finding also a lot in the interviews is the idea that security and deportation still play a very important role. And this is something that I try to explain in my book. In the 20th century, the migration laws of all countries in the region became securitized slowly. So the figure of the foreigner was depicted as a threat in different ways. And that still plays a very important role in the way migration law and migration policies are framed in the region. So this comes also very clearly from the interviews. Let me go through that. A third aspect that I would like to mention is this idea of perceptions and numbers. And this links to what Andrew was saying about the new normal. Because obviously the new normal depends on your own perceptions. What is a lot of migration or what is not a lot of migration? That depends on how you define what a lot of migration is, right? And this is very interesting for me. This is a top Colombian official, for example, telling me that everything has changed in Colombia because now there are more and more immigrants coming to Colombia. Let me remind you that Colombia has 0.3% foreign population, 0.3%. Of course, in the last 10 years, more foreigners have arrived to Colombia. In the minds of important actors in Colombia, that has changed the whole debate, 0.3%. Let me give you another quote. This is a top Andean community official saying that he had to convince a particular country in the region, namely Bolivia, that they were not going to be invaded if the Andean legislation was correctly implemented. Bolivia, again, another country with 0.3%, a little bit more perhaps of immigration. Or let me give you another quote, and I finish with Brazil before I go into one thought I had this morning. This is from an IOM official in Brazil. Brazil, of course, as you know, has 200 million inhabitants, and how the arrival of 80,000 Haitians to Brazil in a period of 5 or 6 years changed completely the discourse on what we mean by immigration in the country, right? So again, 200 million people, 80,000 people arriving, right? But the last thought that I would like to have before I conclude is something that came from a reflection of the new Brazilian immigration law that was adopted yesterday, okay? And this goes to this missing middle. And I wonder whether we are missing something in this missing middle. Let me explain why. All my interviews in Brazil with government officials, international organizations, civil society, NGOs, etc., told me that everyone agreed on this new immigration law. This new immigration law was approved by the Senate, then it was approved by Congress, came back to Senate, was approved again, and now the president of the country yesterday vetoed many of the provisions in that immigration law. My question is that, I raised this because in the last couple of months, since it was again approved in Senate, the law, there was a lot of concerns by actors in Brazil saying that there were a number of YouTubers, a number of bloggers who had captured the debate on migration in Brazil. And again, this idea of if we approve this migration law, we are going to be invaded, right? And they have captured the debate. They were very good in capturing the debate, in leading the conversation towards in a particular direction, right? But obviously, we never interview these people. Sometimes we don't know who these people are, right? Who are these YouTubers? Who are these bloggers? Who are the people who all of a sudden got the ear of the president in saying, you have to veto these particular provisions, otherwise this law is going to be unpopular, right? So this is something obviously I know many of you guys have a lot of experience in conducting interviews in different regions, in different settings, with different actors at all levels, but are we missing something in this missing middle, or in this middle missing, or whatever you want to say, right? So I leave it with that. Thank you.